The late afternoon sun hung merciless in the western sky, turning the endless grassland around Tokala's horse corral into a shimmering expanse of gold and amber that wavered like water in the brutal heat. The air itself seemed to pulse with the weight of July, thick and suffocating, carrying no relief, no promise of evening coolness. Only the relentless press of heat that baked the earth until it cracked and bled dust into the wind. Emma's wrists burned where the rough hemp rope cut deep into her skin, binding her upright against the weathered corner post of the corral fence. The rope was tied with professional precision, the knots positioned just so tight enough to hold her immobile loose enough that she would not lose consciousness from restricted blood flow. Someone had done this before. Someone knew exactly how much pain a body could endure before it ceased to be useful. Her white cotton blouse, freshly laundered that very morning in the basin behind Joseph's store, was now torn at the shoulder seam and caked with a paste of sweat and dust that had dried in stiff, dark streaks down her arms. A purple bruise bloomed around her left eye, the swelling forcing the lid half closed, pulsing with every heartbeat. Her hair, normally pinned in a neat bun at the nape of her neck, hung in tangled strands across her face, plastered to her cheeks with sweat and the dampness of tears she had long since stopped shedding. Crying wasted water. Crying accomplished nothing. She had been standing here for 5 hours. Her legs trembled violently beneath her skirts, the muscles cramping and releasing in waves that made her bite down on her split lip to keep from crying out. The sun had baked her exposed skin until it felt brittle as parchment, ready to split open at the slightest touch. Flies circled her face in lazy, persistent orbits, landing on the cut at her lip, crawling across her closed eyelids. She could not brush them away. She could only endure. Her mouth was so dry that her tongue had swollen, pressing thick and useless against the roof of her mouth. When she tried to swallow, her throat clicked painfully. A small, desperate sound that vanished into the vast silence of the open range. Earlier, how long ago? 2 hours, 3. Joseph had forced a tin cup to her lips, tilting it just enough that a single swallow of tepid water slid down her throat. "Cannot have you dying before you sign." He had said, his voice pleasant, conversational, as if discussing the weather with a neighbor. "I need you alive, Emma. Alive and broken enough to understand your place. But not dead. Not yet." Then he had ridden away with Peg-Leg Dan and the others, leaving her alone beneath the pitiless sky, a piece on a chessboard he was certain he controlled. A shadow moved across her vision, blocking the sun. Emma blinked through the haze of heat exhaustion and pain, forcing her good eye to focus on the figure kneeling in front of her. Tokala. She knew his name from the schoolhouse children who whispered it, with a complicated mixture of fear and admiration. He was Lakota, a warrior, perhaps 2 or 3 years older than her own, 22 years, dressed in worn buckskin leggings and a simple shirt decorated with narrow bands of quill work across the shoulders. Today he wore no war paint. His hair was bound with an otter fur headband and a single eagle feather set low at the back, everyday dress for travel. The full eagle feather war bonnet, a ceremonial honor, remained wrapped and reserved for councils or last stand, not for errands or scouting. He was close enough now that she could see the sheen of sweat on his high cheekbones, the way the cords of muscle stood out along his jaw, clenched tight, with a fury so controlled it radiated from him like heat from sun-baked stone. His eyes dark and steady as the deepest water in blue spring met hers without flinching. There was anger there, yes, but also something else. Assessment, calculation, decision. His hands wrapped around the rope at her wrists, and his fingers brushed her torn, scraped knuckles with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the violence crackling in the air around them. She flinched, not from him, but from the sudden flare of pain as the rope shifted against raw flesh. "Do whatever you want." Emma forced out her voice, a ruined rasp, barely more than a whisper. The words were half terror, half defiance. She did not know if he would free her or kill her. She did not know in that moment if it mattered. Beyond the corral on the higher ground to the west, where the land rose in a long, gentle swell, she knew the riflemen waited. Peg-leg Dan's hired guns, 6 of them, maybe 7, lying belly down in the tall grass, with their Winchesters trained on Tokala's back, waiting for him to make one wrong move so they could shoot him down and call it justice under the bright, indifferent sky. Instead of pulling away, Tokala leaned closer. His voice when he spoke was pitched low, meant for her ears alone, carrying a fury so tightly leashed that it made the hair on the back of her neck rise despite the oppressive heat. "They tied you to my fence," he said each word, deliberate weighted. "They used my land to make their threat. They put their rope on my wood and called it law." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "That makes this my quarrel now." He pulled a long knife from the beaded sheath at his belt. The blade caught the sunlight, flashing like a signal fire, worn steel honed to a razor edge, the handle wrapped in leather, darkened by years of use. He pressed the edge against the thick hemp rope and began to saw, his movements quick and efficient, every stroke purposeful. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She could see the ridge clearly now, the telltale glint of a rifle barrel shifting minutely in the grass, tracking their movement like the eye of a predator. The first Winchester shot cracked across the open prairie, sharp and vicious as a whip, the sound rolling away into the vast emptiness. The bullet slammed into the fence post 6 inches above Tokala's head, splintering the weathered wood and sending a spray of fragments raining down on them both like deadly hail. A day and a half earlier, Wolf's Crossing had shimmered in the brutal grip of midsummer heat, the single wide street that constituted the entire town, baking under a sun that felt close enough to touch. The buildings leaned slightly, their false fronts warped by years of wind and weather paint, peeling away in long, brittle curls that clattered against the boardwalks when the wind picked up. Barbed wire rolls sat stacked like instruments of siege in front of Joseph Harrow's general store, their sharp, twisted spikes glinting in the sun like rows of steel teeth. The wire was new, expensive, imported at great cost from manufacturers back east, and it marked the arrival of a new order on the open range, an order built on fences, on boundaries, on the violent assertion of ownership over land that had never known such divisions. Cattlemen who had once driven their herds freely across the grasslands, following the water and the grass as the seasons turned, now found their trails blocked by wire and armed men. Tempers ran hot in the saloons at night, fueled by whiskey and resentment. The murmurs grew louder. With each passing day, the Lakota had fenced off Blue Spring and the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction, to keep their ponies and their families alive through the brutal summer. To the ranchers, this was theft. To the Lakota, it was survival. The difference between those two truths was rapidly becoming a matter for guns to settle. Emma had arrived in Wolf's Crossing 3 months earlier, stepping down from the dusty Concord stagecoach with a single battered trunk and a letter of introduction from her mother's cousin, Joseph Harrow. She was 22 years old recently, and doubly orphaned, first by her father's sudden death from apoplexy, then by her mother's slower decline from grief and fever. And she had come west because there was nowhere else to go. Her father, a small-time dry goods merchant in Philadelphia, had died, owing more than he owned his business, swallowed by debts she had not even known existed until the creditors came knocking. But he had left a modest inheritance, carefully set aside years earlier in a separate account, enough to pay for her passage west and a few $100s more. Under the laws of the time, as an unmarried woman without father or husband, Emma was legally classified as a femme sole, a woman alone, but in practice, she was a ward. Joseph Harrow, as her closest male relative within 1,000 miles, had become her legal guardian the moment she crossed the territorial line into Wyoming. He controlled her money, her movements, and if he chose her future. Emma worked as a seamstress and assistant to Lucille Brennan, the town's schoolteacher. Lucille was a sharp-eyed widow in her mid-40s, threads of iron gray weaving through her dark hair, who ran the one-room schoolhouse with the same brisk efficiency and unyielding standards she had once applied to managing her late husband's freight business before consumption took him 5 years past. The schoolhouse sat at the eastern edge of town, a simple clapboard structure with a pot-bellied stove, rows of rough-hewn benches scarred with generations of carved initials, and windows that rattled in their frames when the wind blew hard from the mountains. Emma taught letters and basic arithmetic to the children of ranch hands and small farmers in the afternoons, mending their torn primers and stitching patches on the elbows of jackets worn thin by hard use. She also quietly and without announcement left slate boards and chalk on the schoolhouse steps each evening for the 2 Lakota girls who hovered near the fence at the edge of the schoolyard, watching with wide, wary eyes, but never daring to come inside. Each morning, the chalk was worn down to nubs, and the slates bore careful rows of letters copied over and over, until the strokes were nearly perfect. Across the street in the small clapboard clinic that smelled perpetually of carbolic and lamp oil, Dr. Oscar Finch extracted a bullet from the shoulder of a Lakota boy, while Tokala stood nearby, arms folded across his chest, his face carved from stone. The boy, no more than 14, his name was Chaska, had taken the bullet while driving his family's small herd of ponies away from a group of white riders who had tried to cut the fence around Blue Spring with wire cutters and threats. Oscar worked in silence, his movements precise, and practiced probing the wound with a slender metal instrument that glinted dully in the afternoon light streaming through the window. He asked no questions. He made no judgments. He treated the Lakota child with the same meticulous care he would have given to any ranch hand or miner, stitching the torn flesh with neat, even stitches, his hands as steady as stone. Out in the street, a knot of men had gathered, their voices low, but edged with anger, carrying clearly through the open window. Emma, sitting at her sewing table in the schoolhouse, paused with her needle halfway through a torn seam and glanced up. She could see them from where she sat, 6 ranchers, and their hired hands' faces flushed with heat and temper. Hands drifting repeatedly toward the guns holstered at their hips, as if seeking reassurance from the weight of iron. They muttered that the doctor and the schoolteacher were turning against their own kind, betraying the unspoken but ironclad code that kept white and native worlds separate, that maintained the orders everyone understood. Oscar Finch was a tall, lean man in his middle 50s, his hair gone entirely silver, his face lined deeply from years of hard work in unforgiving country. He had come west after the war, carrying a medical bag, and too many memories he never spoke of field hospitals, screaming men, limbs piled like cordwood outside surgical tents. He did not talk about those years, but his hands never shook, not even when the work was bloody and the patient thrashed and screamed. He glanced up at Tokala as he tied off the final stitch, his voice quiet and matter-of-fact. Keep the wound clean. Change the dressing daily. If it festers, if you see red streaks running up his arm, bring him back immediately. Tokala inclined his head, once a gesture that managed to convey both acknowledgement and a kind of reserved dignity, and lifted the boy, carefully cradling him as if he were made of glass. He carried him out through the back door to avoid the men clustered in front of the clinic, their faces hard as the stones that littered the prairie. Emma watched through the schoolhouse window, her needle forgotten, and saw the way the crowd parted as Tokala emerged into the alley. Saw the way their hands tightened on their gun belts, saw the cold calculation in their eyes. Joseph Harrow, impeccably dressed in a wool vest and crisp white shirt, despite the stifling heat, stood in the shade of his store's awning, thumbs hooked casually in his vest pockets, observing the scene with the calm, assessing gaze of a man placing bets at a horse race. He was 40 years old, handsome in a cold, polished way. Dark hair slicked back with pomade, a neat mustache, and a smile that slid on and off his face like a mask donned for the convenience of an audience. He was deeply in debt, a fact known to very few from disastrous investments in the Diamond Creek silver mine, a claim that had promised riches and delivered only worthlessness, costing him thousands of dollars he did not have. He needed total control of Blue Spring to corner the local cattle market, to squeeze every rancher and farmer in the territory until they bled money directly into his hands. And he had the perfect tool to accomplish it, coverture, the legal doctrine enshrined in territorial law that granted a husband absolute control over his wife's property earnings and legal identity. Once Emma signed a marriage contract, or could be compelled to sign it in front of a judge, her modest inheritance, and any land claims that could be tied to her name, would become his, legally and irrevocably. He had already retained Peg-Leg Dan, a bounty hunter and range enforcer, whose reputation for solving inconvenient problems with a rifle and a shallow grave extended from the Powder River country all the way south to the Platte. Emma did not yet understand the full scope of Joseph's plans, but she had learned quickly and painfully to move quietly in his presence, to keep her gaze lowered and her voice soft. He was unfailingly polite to her in public, addressing her as cousin and offering small courtesies, a chair pulled out, a door held open. But in private, his voice took on a flat, cold edge, and his fingers dug into her arm hard enough to leave bruises when she asked questions about the ledgers or the men who came and went from his store at odd hours. She had been living in a narrow room above the store for 3 months now, taking her meals at Joseph's table under the watchful, silent presence of Mrs. Gray, the housekeeper, a gaunt, colorless woman who never met anyone's eyes, that moved through the house like a specter, all rustling skirts and downcast gaze. On the evening that changed everything, Emma was refilling the glass ink bottles at the telegraph counter in the cramped back room of Joseph's store. Clemens, the nervous young telegraph operator, had left early complaining of stomach pains, and Joseph had asked her politely, always politely, to tidy up before closing. The room was small and windowless, smelling of old paper lamp oil and the faint metallic tang of ink. Through the thin plank wall that separated the telegraph office from Joseph's private study, Emma heard voices and froze her hand, suspended above an ink bottle. She set the bottle down with exquisite care, holding her breath, and leaned closer to the wall. There was a crack between 2 of the planks, narrow as a knife blade, and through it she could see slivers of the room beyond, lamplight at the edge of a desk, 2 figures standing. Joseph's voice drifted through the gap, smooth and controlled, each word enunciated with the precision of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The Lakota have fenced off Blue Spring. Every rancher within 20 miles is screaming for water, and prices are climbing daily. If I control that spring, when I control it, I will control the price of every head of cattle that moves through this territory. I will own them all, and they will pay whatever I demand or watch their herds die of thirst. Another voice answered, rougher, slurred slightly with whiskey. Peg-Leg Dan. And if the Lakota don't move, if they dig in? They will move, Joseph said, his tone flat and certain as a judge pronouncing sentence. One way or another, I have the legal framework in place. The girl's inheritance provides the leverage I need. Once she signs the marriage papers, and she will sign, believe me, the land claim becomes ironclad. The territorial court will uphold it. The Lakota will be removed east of the reservation line, or they will starve where they stand. Either outcome suits my purposes. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, each beat so loud she was certain they would hear it through the wall. Moving with infinite caution, she slid the ink bottle aside and pressed her eye to the crack. Joseph and Peg-Leg Dan stood over a heavy oak desk, a half-empty bottle of amber whiskey standing between them, like a third conspirator. Spread across the desk were documents, an official-looking deed, bearing the territorial seal, its edges crisp and white. A draft marriage contract with her name written in Joseph's neat, controlled hand at the top. And beneath those, a stack of what looked like bank drafts and receipts. Joseph's finger jabbed at the deed, leaving a small dent in the stiff paper. As soon as Emma signs this in front of Judge Whitaker, everything becomes legal and binding under territorial law. Her father's inheritance pays off my debts at the mine funds, the purchase of enough barbed wire to fence every water source from here to the mountains, and finances the men I need to enforce the new boundaries. The Lakota lose their water and their leverage. The small farmers either lease from me at rates I set, or they go bankrupt and I buy their land for pennies on the dollar. Within 2 years, I will control this entire valley from the spring to the river. And no one, not the territorial governor, not the Indian agent, not the Cattlemen's Association, will be able to touch me. Peg-Leg Dan, a squat, powerful man with a wooden leg and a face like cracked leather, grinned and took a long pull directly from the whiskey bottle. And if the girl balks, if she refuses to sign? Joseph's expression shifted, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the cold, calculating ruthlessness beneath. Then I will ensure she understands the precariousness of her situation. Fear is an excellent teacher, Dan. Stubbornness, on the other hand, can be corrected, or if necessary, eliminated once she has served her purpose. Emma's blood turned to ice in her veins. She understood with sudden terrible clarity he could not kill her yet, because he needed her alive and coherent, long enough to sign the documents in front of witnesses. But once her signature was on that marriage contract, once the deed was recorded in the territorial ledger, her life would be worth less than the paper it was written on. Coverture would erase her legal existence, entirely folding her identity into his, like a shadow swallowed by a larger darkness, her hands shaking violently. Emma reached through the narrow crack and with agonizing slowness slid the top ledger page and a folded copy of the deed out from beneath the whiskey bottle. The paper rasped faintly against the wood. She held her breath, certain they would hear, certain she would be caught, but the men were too focused on their plans, too confident in their control. She tucked the stolen documents into her bodice, folding them small, pressing them flat against her ribs where the bones would hold them secure. As she turned to slip away, the floorboard beneath her left foot groaned a sharp, treacherous sound in the close silence. Before she could move, before she could even draw breath to scream, Peg-Leg Dan's hand shot out and clamped around her upper arm like an iron manacle. He yanked her backward with brutal force, spinning her around and dragging her into the lamplight. Joseph's face, which had been smooth and pleasant a moment before, twisted into something sharp and ugly, all pretense stripped away. He stepped forward, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Eavesdropping, Emma, stealing from your own family." His voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You have just made a very serious mistake." Emma tried to pull free, but Dan's grip was unbreakable. She opened her mouth to scream, and Joseph's hand clamped over it, muffling the sound before it could form. He leaned close, his breath hot against her ear, smelling of whiskey and something sour beneath. "You will sign those papers tomorrow." He whispered, each word deliberate and precise. "You will sign them willingly, and you will smile while you do it. Or you will discover exactly how unpleasant the alternative can be." He nodded to Dan, who began dragging her toward the back door, her heels scraping uselessly against the floorboards. Emma fought with everything she had, kicking, clawing, twisting, but Dan was a man who had made his living through violence for 2 decades, and her resistance was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He slammed her head against the doorframe as they passed through, and the world exploded into white light and sickening pain. Then darkness that swallowed everything. When consciousness returned, she was lying in the bed of a wagon, wrists already bound the night sky, wheeling overhead cold stars, watching her suffering with perfect indifference. Each jolt of the wagon over the rutted trail sent fresh agony lancing through her skull. She could taste blood, copper, and salt where she had bitten her tongue. Hours passed, how many she could not say. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the darkness eventually began to pale at the eastern horizon. By the time the wagon finally lurched to a halt, dawn was breaking across the grassland, painting everything in shades of rose and gold that seemed obscene in their beauty. Dan and two other men hauled her out, roughly their hands, careless and cruel, and dragged her across the open prairie toward a horse corral she recognized, even through the haze of pain. Tokala's corral. They lashed her to the corner fence post with professional efficiency, pulling the ropes tight enough to bite deep, but not tight enough to cut off circulation entirely. Joseph stood a few paces away, brushing dust from his vest, his face calm and pleasant once more, as if they were simply attending to some mundane business transaction. He stepped close to her, close enough that she could see the cold calculation in his eyes, and produced a tin cup from his saddlebag. He held it to her cracked lips, tilting it just enough that a single swallow of tepid water slid down her parched throat, not enough to ease the thirst, only enough to keep her alive. "I need you functional, Emma," he said conversationally, almost kindly. "Alive and frightened, but not dead. Not yet. You see, this serves multiple purposes. When Tokala arrives, and he will because men like him cannot resist the lure of a woman in distress, Dan's men will kill him. A tragic accident, of course. A misunderstanding. And you, traumatized by your ordeal, will sign whatever I place in front of you, grateful for my protection. If, however, you prove uncooperative, well, the story will be that you ran off with the savage, and things ended badly, as they always do in such situations. Either way, I win. The land becomes mine. The water becomes mine. Everything becomes mine." He straightened, replacing the cup in his saddlebag with care. "Think on it, Emma. The sun is quite unforgiving at this time of year." He turned to Pegleg Dan, issuing final instructions in a voice that carried clearly in the still morning air. "Keep your men on the ridge. Rifles trained. The moment Tokala steps into the open, you kill him. Clean shot center mass. No wounded warrior limping away to tell tales. After we ride back to town, I'll bring the good doctor to examine her, and we'll all agree she suffered terribly and needs rest and care. Tomorrow or the day after, when she's had time to understand her situation, we'll have our signing." They rode away, 6 men spreading out along the ridge above the corral, finding positions in the tall grass where they could lie prone with their rifles invisible against the dun-colored earth. Emma was left alone beneath the climbing sun, a piece on a board, a tool to be used and discarded. The hours that followed were the longest of her life. The sun climbed higher, and with it came heat that pressed down on Emma like a physical weight, stealing the air from her lungs, making each breath a struggle. Her tongue swelled in her mouth. Her vision swam narrowing to a dark tunnel edged with sparks of light that danced and vanished. She tried to work the ropes loose, twisting her wrists, but the knots only tightened, biting deeper, and the pain eventually became so overwhelming that she stopped trying, conserving what little strength remained. Time lost all meaning. The sun crawled across the sky with agonizing slowness, or perhaps it raced, she could no longer tell. Flies found her, drawn by the scent of sweat and blood, crawling across her face into her mouth when she gasped for air. She could not even summon the energy to shake her head to dislodge them. And then, through the haze and the pain, she heard the distant rhythm of hoofbeats growing steadily louder. She forced her good eye open, squinting against the glare, and saw a rider approaching from the east, a single figure on horseback, moving at an easy canter that slowed to a walk as he drew near. Tokala. He dismounted while still 20 yards away, moving with the fluid economy of someone who had spent his entire life on horseback. His eyes swept the ridge, the corral, the fence line, reading the land, reading the trap before he even looked at her directly. When he did finally approach, kneeling in front of her, she saw the exact moment his gaze took in the professional knots, the calculated placement of her body, the sheer, deliberate cruelty of leaving her here, visible from every angle, exposed and helpless. His face hardened, but when he spoke, his voice was pitched low and steady, meant only for her. They used my fence, my land. That makes this mine to answer. And then the first shot cracked across the prairie, and everything became motion and chaos, and the sudden, desperate struggle to survive. Tokala's knife flashed in the sun as he sawed through the rope. The second shot struck the post, sending splinters flying. Emma's arms were suddenly free, and she collapsed forward, her legs buckling, unable to support her weight. Tokala caught her one arm, locking around her waist, and hauled her upright. "Can you run?" His voice was urgent, sharp. I don't know. You will." He half carried, half dragged her toward the back of the corral, his body positioned between her and the ridge, where the rifles barked and spat. A young Lakota boy, she would later learn his name, was Chatton darted out from behind a hayrick, leading Tokala's horse with one hand, his face tight with fear and determination. Tokala shouted something in Lakota, sharp and commanding. Then the boy released the reins and sprinted for cover. Tokala lifted Emma bodily and threw her into the saddle with a strength born of desperation. She grabbed the horse's mane with both hands, tangling her fingers in the coarse hair, and then Tokala was behind her. His arm like an iron bar across her waist, and the horse was moving, plunging forward through the broken section of fence. Bullets kicked up geysers of dirt around the horse's hooves. One tore through the sleeve of Emma's blouse so close she felt the heat of its passage. The animal lunged down the slope toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the river, its breath coming in great, heaving gasps, foam flecking its neck. They crashed through the underbrush and into the shallow ford, water exploding around them in silver sheets. The cold was shocking after the hours of heat, and Emma gasped, her body shuddering. On the far bank, Tokala slid from the saddle and pulled her down after him, both of them crouching in the cover of the trees. His left arm was bleeding a long, ragged furrow where a bullet had grazed him from shoulder to elbow, the flesh torn and raw. Emma's hands were shaking so badly she could barely function. But she tore a strip from her petticoat and wrapped it around his arm, knotting it as tightly as she could manage. He grunted once, a sound of pain quickly suppressed. And then they were moving again, deeper into the cottonwoods, staying low, staying quiet. "We go to town," Tokala said, his voice tight. "To the doctor, to the teacher. You have proof." Emma pulled the folded papers from her bodice, damp now with sweat and river water, but still legible. Tokala took them, his eyes scanning the words he could not fully read, but recognizing the seal, the map, and the damning evidence of theft and conspiracy. "Then we use it," he said. "But first we run." They reached Wolf's Crossing well after dark, moving through the alleys like shadows, avoiding the main street where lanterns burned in saloon windows and voices carried on the night air. The clinic's back door opened at Tokala's knock, 2 sharp raps, a pause, one more. And Oscar Finch stepped aside, wordlessly, letting them in and closing the door quickly behind them. Inside, by the light of a single lamp turned low, Oscar examined Tokala's arm with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound with alcohol that must have burned like fire, but elicited no sound from the warrior. He stitched it closed with neat, precise sutures, while Emma laid the stolen papers on his desk with trembling hands. "Joseph forged a deed," she said, her voice raw and unsteady. "He's planning to use my inheritance to fund a water war. He left me tied to Tokala's fence as bait, intending to kill him and force me to sign marriage papers. He has Peg-Leg Dan and at least 6 armed men. We need help." Oscar tied off the final stitch and looked up, his face grave. "Lucille," he said. "We need Lucille Brennan. She knows territorial law better than anyone within 100 miles. He sent a boy, one of the stable hands, to fetch the schoolteacher, and within 20 minutes Lucille arrived, her shawl pulled tight despite the lingering heat, her eyes sharp and assessing. She read the documents by lamplight, her expression growing darker with each line. "Coverture," she said flatly, her finger tracing the relevant passage. "He's using you as a legal bridge, Emma. Once you sign a marriage contract, everything you own or might inherit becomes his property by law. The deed claims Blue Spring under your name, which means once you marry him, he controls the water. The Lakota lose their access. The small farmers get squeezed out. Joseph becomes the sole authority on water rights for the entire valley." "Can we stop him?" Emma asked, leaning forward. Lucille looked at her, and then at Tokala, measuring them both. "We need more. We need the original documents, not just copies. We need financial records showing where the money went. We need witnesses willing to testify in front of Judge Whitaker when he arrives for the circuit. And we need to move fast because Joseph will know by now that you've escaped and he'll be covering his tracks." "The mine," Tokala said quietly. "Diamond Creek. That's where his debts are. If there are records, they'll be there." "Joseph will expect us to run," Emma said. "Either to the Lakota camp or east toward Cheyenne. He won't expect us to go deeper into his territory." "Then that's what we do," Tokala said, standing. The fresh bandage on his arm was already spotted with blood, but his face showed no sign of weakness. They slipped out into the night, and Oscar stood in the doorway, watching them go, his face drawn with worry and something that might have been admiration. The ride to Diamond Creek took the better part of 2 days, following game trails that wound through broken country gullies choked with sage ridges of red stone that thrust up from the earth like broken bones, and long stretches of grassland that offered no cover from watching eyes. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping in turns during the brutal heat of midday, hidden in the scant shade of rock overhangs or dry creek beds where the air was marginally cooler. On the first night, Tokala's cousin Ahanu found them at a predetermined rendezvous point, a lightning-scarred cottonwood that stood alone on a low rise. Ahanu was perhaps a year younger than Tokala, lean and quick with a long scar running from temple to jaw, the souvenir of a rancher's whip 3 summers past. He brought fresh horses a canteen of water that tasted like life itself and news that made them all tense. Joseph's men were combing the town, offering a $50 reward for information leading to Emma's return. $50. The price of a decent horse. The price of a woman's life. "He's telling people I ran off," Emma said, her voice bitter. "That I'm not in my right mind. That I've been seduced or coerced by—" She glanced at Tokala, unable to finish the sentence. "By savages." Tokala finished for her, his tone flat and unsurprised. "It's an old story. A convenient story." They rode through the second night in tense silence, the horses picking their way carefully over treacherous ground, and by dawn of the third day, they could see Diamond Creek, a narrow canyon, where a played-out silver vein had once drawn hundreds of prospectors with dreams of wealth. Now only a skeleton crew remained, 20 or 30 men, working the tailings for scraps, their faces hollow and hungry. The main office was a low structure of rough-hewn timber and tar paper roofing surrounded by rusted equipment and slag heaps that glittered faintly with mica and fool's gold. They made camp in a ravine a half-mile from the mine, hidden from casual view, and spent an hour observing the layout through a battered pair of field glasses Ahanu produced from his saddlebag. 2 guards stood watch at the office entrance, rifles cradled in their arms, their movements bored and routine. "The back window is broken," Tokala said, lowering the glasses. "You could fit through." Emma studied the building, her heart already pounding. "What about the guards?" "We draw them away," Ahanu said, his English halting but clear. "You go in. Fast. Find papers. Get out." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had. They moved closer as the sun climbed higher, using the slag heaps for cover, the sharp edges of broken rock cutting through Emma's thin boots. Ahanu circled wide to the far side of the office, moving with a hunter's patience, while Tokala and Emma waited in the shadow of a rusted ore cart, hardly daring to breathe. When Ahanu's signal came, a tin can thrown hard against the office wall. The clatter shockingly loud in the still air. Both guards came running, shouting, rifles raised. Emma darted forward, heart hammering, and squeezed through the broken window, the jagged glass catching her skirt and tearing it. Inside the office was dim and stifling, smelling of stale tobacco and old sweat. A strongbox sat beneath the desk, its lock broken, and she dropped to her knees beside it, rummaging through the contents with shaking hands. At the bottom, beneath layers of receipts and claim forms, she found what they needed: an iron-bound folder labeled Harrow in faded ink. Inside were ledgers detailing payments to Pegleg Dan, to Sheriff Cobb, to the men who had cut fences and driven off Lakota horses. There was a signed authorization in Joseph's own hand, ordering the removal of hostiles from the Blue Spring area. There were contracts, bank drafts, a web of financial crime laid bare. Emma shoved the papers into her shirt front and turned toward the window. As she reached for the sill, the office door slammed open with a crash that made her heart stop. One of the guards stood there, rifle leveled directly at her chest, his face twisted with anger and the anticipation of violence. "Got you now," he said, thumbing back the hammer. Before he could fire, Tokala appeared behind him like a vengeful spirit, slamming the butt of his rifle into the man's skull with brutal efficiency. The guard dropped unconscious before he hit the floor. Tokala grabbed Emma's wrist and hauled her through the window glass, slicing her palms, and they ran for the horses. But they were only halfway to the ravine when riders appeared at the canyon mouth. Pegleg Dan, leading 6 men all heavily armed, silhouetted against the rising sun, like the 4 horsemen of some terrible apocalypse. Tokala cursed in Lakota, the words sharp and vicious, and changed direction, plunging toward a side tunnel. An old exploratory shaft driven into the hillside decades ago, its entrance half hidden by creosote and sage. They plunged into darkness, the temperature dropping instantly, the air thick with moisture and the smell of old stone. Behind them, lanterns bobbed and voices echoed Dan's men advancing with grim determination. The tunnel was narrow, forcing them to move single file, the ceiling so low that Tokala had to duck his shoulders, brushing the damp walls. Ahanu led, moving by feel and memory, finding his way through the darkness with uncanny precision. They were perhaps 200 yards into the hillside when the shooting started, not behind them, but from deeper in the mine. One of the miners, a young man whose brother had been saved from drowning by Tokala's people the previous summer, had turned on Dan's gunmen, swinging a pickaxe in desperate, futile resistance. The distraction bought them seconds precious and irreplaceable. But in the chaos, as they scrambled toward the far exit, where a daylight showed as a pale disk in the distance, Emma stumbled over a rotted timber and fell hard, the breath driven from her lungs. She lay gasping, unable to move. And in that instant, one of Dan's men appeared at the bend behind them, rifle rising, finger tightening on the trigger. Ahanu moved without hesitation, without thought, throwing himself backward to cover Emma's body with his own. The rifle cracked shockingly loud in the confined space, and Ahanu jerked his body, folding. Blood spread across his chest in a dark, terrible bloom. Tokala caught him as he fell, easing him down, and Emma scrambled to her knees beside them, her hands instinctively pressing against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding that pulsed hot and rhythmic between her fingers. But the bullet had gone deep, piercing lung or heart or both, and Ahanu's breath came in shallow, wet gasps, each one weaker than the last. His eyes found Tokala's face, and he managed a single word in Lakota, a word Emma did not understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. "Go?" Then his gaze shifted to Emma, and for just a moment his hand closed weakly over hers, where it pressed against his chest. His lips moved, forming words in English words he had practiced in secret because he wanted to speak to her to thank her for teaching his sister letters. You. Good. You. Stay strong. Then the light faded from his eyes, and he was gone. More gunfire echoed through the tunnel. An overloaded ore cart, its brake released by the desperate miner, came hurtling down the track with a scream of tortured metal. Tokala pulled Emma to her feet and flattened them both against the wet stone wall as the cart roared past, so close the wind of its passage tugged at their clothes, showering them with sparks that burned like angry stars. They stumbled out into the blinding daylight of the ravine, gasping, and above them, peg-leg Dan's remaining men fanned out along the ridge lanterns and rifles glinting in the harsh sun. But Ahanu's body lay behind them in the darkness, and the weight of that death settled onto Emma's shoulders like a mantle of stone. He saved me, she whispered, her voice breaking. He died for me. He died so we could finish this. Tokala said, his voice raw and scraped with grief. Don't let it be for nothing. They took a mule from a hobbled string near the mine entrance and rode double the animal, picking its way carefully down a trail barely wide enough for one, the drop to the river below, dizzying and deadly. By the time they reached Wolf's Crossing again, exhausted and hollow-eyed, the sun was setting, and the weight of what they carried, the papers, the proof, and the debt of a life given, pressed down on them like the judgment of God. 3 nights later, after the papers had been hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Oscar's clinic, and plans had been laid with Lucille and the few farmers brave enough to stand against Joseph, Harrow Tokala took Emma out beyond the edge of town to a dry wash where the sound of gunfire would not carry far. The moon hung full and bright overhead, turning the landscape into a study in silver and shadow. He handed her his spare revolver, a worn Colt with a walnut grip, polished smooth by years of use, its weight startling in her hand, heavy as sin. You need to know how to use this, he said simply. Not because I won't be there, but because there will come a moment when I can't reach you in time, and you'll need to save yourself. Emma looked at the weapon, feeling its weight, its cold solidity, the promise of violence it contained. I've never fired a gun, she admitted, her voice small in the vast darkness. Then tonight you learn. He stood behind her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her back, and adjusted her grip with careful impersonal efficiency, showing her where to place her thumb, how to wrap her fingers, how to stand, so the recoil wouldn't knock her backward. Both hands. Breathe out, then squeeze, don't pull, squeeze. And Emma. He paused, making sure she was listening. Don't think. Thinking takes time you won't have. Let your body remember. He set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log, 20 paces away, their shapes stark against the moonlit sand. Emma raised the revolver, aimed as he had shown her, and pulled no squeeze the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil like being punched in the wrists, the flash blinding. The bullet went wide, kicking up sand 5 feet to the left of the target. The gun had a will of its own, a violence she had not anticipated, and her hands shook with the shock of it. Again, Tokala said. She fired again and again. Her wrists ached, then burned, then went numb. The smell of gunpowder filled her nose, acrid and choking. Her ears rang with a high, thin whine that drowned out all other sound. But slowly, gradually, her body began to learn what her mind could not grasp, the weight, the balance, the moment when the hammer fell. By the end of the night, she had hit 3 cans, the sharp ping of bullets striking metal, absurdly satisfying. Tokala reloaded the revolver with practiced ease and handed it back. Keep this. In your belt, hidden. Don't show it unless you're willing to use it. And if you use it, don't miss. The following dawn, red and ominous, He taught her to reload his hands, guiding hers through the mechanical dance of opening the cylinder, ejecting spent casings, thumbing fresh rounds into the chambers. If you run out and there's no time run, don't stand and fight with an empty gun. That's just dying with style. On the third night, he varied the drill targets at different distances, some close, some far, some half hidden behind rocks. In a real fight, nothing stands still. You won't have time to aim carefully. You point, you fire, you move. Show me. Emma drew the revolver, pointed, fired. The shot went wide. She adjusted, fired again. Closer. A third shot, and the can leapt into the air, spinning end over end before clattering to the ground. The fierce satisfaction that surged through her was almost frightening in its intensity. "Good," Tokala said, and it was the first word of praise he had offered. "Remember that. When the moment comes, your mind will freeze. Fear will fill you up. But your body will remember if you've trained it. Don't think, just do." Later, sitting together in the cool darkness, Emma turned the revolver over in her hands, feeling its weight differently now, not as a burden or a curse, but as a choice, a tool, a means of agency in a world that had tried to strip her of all three. "I never imagined I would need this," she said quietly. "Most people don't," Tokala replied. "Until they do. And by then, it's usually too late to learn." On the nights between the shooting lessons when exhaustion kept them from sleep, they sat together on the back steps of Oscar's clinic and talked tentatively at first, then with increasing honesty, as if the darkness granted them permission to speak truths they could not voice in daylight. "Why did you come back for me?" Emma asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "At the fence. You could have ridden away. Let them take me." Tokala was silent for a long moment, his fingers moving methodically over the barrel of his rifle, cleaning away grit and oil. "Because they used my land," he said finally. "They tied you there to draw me out to make me responsible. They thought I would accept their rules of their trap. They were wrong. Was it only that pride?" He looked at her then, and in the moonlight, his face was unguarded. "No, not only that. Leaving you there, leaving anyone there, would have been wrong. Not because of what they would have done to you, though that mattered, but because accepting that kind of cruelty, letting it stand unchallenged, would have meant agreeing that the world they want to build is acceptable. And it's not." Emma nodded slowly, understanding more than the words conveyed. "Joseph thought he could control me because I'm a woman. Because the law says I'm incomplete without a man to speak for me, to own me. He thought fear would be enough." "It's a bad law," Tokala said bluntly. "It's the law we have," Emma said. "And if we don't fight it the right way with legal proof and witnesses, we'll lose everything. Your people have too many laws." Tokala said, a hint of frustration coloring his voice. "Laws for everything: who can own water, who can own land, who can own other people. You make rules for the rain." "And your people?" Emma asked, genuinely curious. "We have laws too, but they're about balance, about responsibility. If you take from the land, you give back. If you harm the people, you answer for it. Blue Spring doesn't belong to anyone, but we've cared for it, protected it for generations. That makes us responsible for it. Not owners, stewards. Do you understand the difference?" "I think I'm beginning to," Emma said. "It's not about possession. It's about obligation." "Yes," Tokala said, and she heard approval in his voice, a respect she had not earned before this moment. Another night, as they shared a sparse meal of beans and hardtack outside the clinic, Emma asked, "What will you do if we win? If the judge voids the deed and Joseph loses?" Tokala shrugged. "Go back to my people. Rebuild the fence that keeps our horses safe. Protect the spring. Live." He looked at her. "And you?" "I don't know," Emma admitted. Before this, I thought I would go back east, find work in a city, disappear into crowds where no one knew my name or my shame. But now I don't want to disappear. I want to matter. I want to fight for something real. Tokala nodded. Then stay. Fight. Will your people accept me? Emma asked, voicing a fear she had barely acknowledged, even to herself. Tokala considered this carefully, not dismissing her concern. Some will, some won't. But if you prove yourself, if you keep your word and work beside us, they will respect you. Respect matters more than acceptance. Acceptance is given. Respect is earned. On the final night before the confrontation, they all knew was coming. Emma found herself unable to sleep, her mind churning with fear and what-ifs. She found Tokala sitting on the porch rail, looking out at the dark shapes of buildings and the distant line of bluffs, barely visible against the starlit sky. "Are you afraid?" she asked, settling beside him. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Only a fool feels no fear before a fight. But you don't show it. Showing fear doesn't help, but feeling it keeps you careful, keeps you alive." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm afraid too. Not just of dying, of failing, of signing those papers and losing everything and knowing I was too weak to stop it." Tokala turned to look at her, and when he spoke, his voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. "You're not weak. Weak people don't steal evidence from dangerous men. Weak people don't ride into a mine full of guns. You're afraid that's different. Fear is smart. Weakness is giving up. You haven't given up." Emma felt something tight in her chest, loosen just a little. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Tokala said. "Just remember it. When the time comes, remember who you are, not who they told you to be." The telegraph Oscar sent to Joseph's lawyer was carefully crafted, each word chosen with precision. Emma Harrow, willing to discuss terms. Requests meeting at Diamond Creek property for inspection of deed and contract. Noon, 3 days hence. Neutral ground. Witnesses present. The lawyer, eager to close what he believed would be a lucrative transaction, relayed the message to Joseph within hours. Joseph's reply came the following morning, terse and confident. Agreed. We'll bring original documents. Expect cooperation. Lucille gathered a handful of farmers whose homesteads depended on access to Blue Spring hard men with weathered faces and calloused hands. Men who had watched their water prices climb while their margins shrank, who were tired of being squeezed. Sheriff Cobb, sweating and pale, agreed to come as well, though everyone knew he had taken Joseph's money in the past. His name was in the ledgers they'd stolen, and he knew it. The trap was set. The players were moving into position. And everyone understood that blood would be shed before the sun set again. The old adit on the bluff above the river was a desolate place abandoned for a decade or more after the vein had played out. The entrance was a rough-hewn arch of rotting timbers driven into the hillside, half collapsed with an oar rail jutting out over the canyon like a skeletal finger pointing at the sky. The drop to the river below was sheer 200 feet or more, and the sound of water running over stones was a distant whisper, faint and mocking. Tokala and 2 other Lakota warriors, Chatan, and a silent, scarred man named Mado, took positions among the rocks above the entrance, concealing their rifles beneath blankets, becoming part of the landscape. In a quiet moment before the parley, Tokala unwrapped his full eagle feather war bonnet and set it on an overt sign to friend and foe that this was no ambush, but a final reckoning witnessed by the spirits and by men. Oscar and Lucille stood near the tunnel mouth with the farmers, all of them armed, but trying to maintain an air of calm negotiation rather than violence. Sheriff Cobb shifted constantly from foot to foot, his hand never far from his revolver, his face the color of old dough. Emma waited near the oar rail alone and exposed the folder of stolen documents clutched under one arm. She wore a plain work dress and a belt with Tokala's spare revolver hidden at the small of her back covered by her shawl. The weight of it was both comforting and terrifying. Joseph arrived precisely at noon, leading a column of 8 men. Peg-leg Dan rode at his right-hand rifle across his saddle, his wooden leg creaking with each step of his horse. The other 6 were hard-faced gunmen mercenaries who killed for wages and slept soundly afterward. Strapped to one man's saddle were bundles of dynamite with brass blasting caps already crimped and short stubs of safety fuse, careless deadly. It was enough to bring down the entire Adite and bury everyone inside if things went wrong. Or if Joseph simply decided it was more convenient than witnesses. Joseph dismounted with elegant precision, adjusting his vest and walking forward as if attending a church social, his smile pleasant and entirely false. "You look tired, Emma," he said, his voice carrying across the open space. "This unpleasantness has gone on long enough. Sign the papers and I'll see you're well cared for. Comfortable, protected." Emma lifted the folder, holding it so everyone, the farmers, the sheriff, the watching gunmen, could see. "These documents say you paid men to murder Tokala's people, that you planned to kill us in a mine accident. Is that your idea of protection, Joseph?" Joseph's smile thinned, his eyes hardening. "You're hysterical, Emma. A woman's weakness. You need guidance structure. I need the truth told." Emma interrupted, her voice rising. "And so do they." She gestured to the farmers. "How many of you have paid Joseph for water this summer? How many have been told the price is rising again and again until your herds die of thirst or you go bankrupt?" Angry murmurs rippled through the group. Joseph's jaw tightened, his mask slipping. "This is slander. I'm your legal guardian. I'm trying to save you from your own foolishness. You tied me to a fence and left me to die." Emma's voice cracked with fury. "You forged my name, you stole my inheritance, and you killed a man to keep your secrets." Peg-leg Dan reached for his gun, a smooth, practiced draw that spoke of decades of violence. That was Tokala's signal. From the rocks above, he and his men fired the shots, cracking sharp and clear. One of Joseph's gunmen went down, clutching his chest, blood spreading. Horses reared. Men shouted, chaos erupted. Tokala worked the lever on his Winchester, chambering another round. But as he shifted position to fire again, Dan's rifle swung up with deadly precision and cracked once. The bullet took Tokala high in the right shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him backward against the rocks. He went down hard, the rifle clattering from his hands, blood welling dark and thick between his fingers as he tried to stanch the wound. Emma saw Tokala fall, and the world seemed to slow each heartbeat, stretching into an eternity. Dan was already swinging his rifle toward her, taking his time, now confident in his control of the situation. The farmers scattered for cover, shouting. Sheriff Cobb dove behind a boulder, useless. Tokala, bleeding and disarmed, met her eyes across the distance. And then he did something that made no tactical sense, something that defied every instinct of self-preservation. He drew his revolver with his left hand, clumsy, weak, and tossed it down the slope toward her. The weapon slid through the loose gravel and came to rest at her feet. "Kick it away." Dan snarled, his rifle trained on her chest, now finger tightening on the trigger. Emma bent, as if to obey, every muscle screaming at her to comply, to survive, to submit, as she had been taught her entire life. But Ahanu's face rose in her mind, his last words, "Stay strong," and Tokala's voice echoed in her memory, "Don't think, let your body remember." She scooped up the revolver in one rough, graceless motion, thumbed back the hammer, and in the split second before Dan could fire, she made a choice that changed everything. She did not aim at Dan. She was not fast enough, not skilled enough to outdraw a man who had killed for 20 years. Instead, she drew a bead on the thumb-sized brass blasting cap, crimped into the top stick of dynamite on the nearest saddle, a foolishly exposed glint of metal. She squeezed the trigger. The world exploded. The bullet struck the cap dead center, and the dynamite detonated with a force that seemed to tear the air apart. The sound was beyond hearing, beyond comprehension, a physical blow that threw Emma backward and slammed her into the ground, hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. The entire front of the adit collapsed in a roaring avalanche of stone and splintered timber, and the earth itself shook like a living thing in agony. Dust and debris filled the air, choking, blinding. Emma lay gasping, her ears ringing with a high, thin whine that drowned out all other sound. Somewhere through the dust, she could hear screaming, but it seemed distant, unreal. Hands grabbed her. Tokala's hands, his left arm useless and bleeding, but his right still strong, and he dragged her away from the collapsing tunnel rocks raining down around them, some as large as a man's head. They stumbled and fell and crawled and finally collapsed together in a hollow 20 yards from the devastation, coughing and gasping. When the dust began to settle, the destruction was total. The adit entrance had collapsed entirely, and Joseph Harrow lay pinned beneath a massive timber, crushed from the waist down. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading. His face was white, his breath coming in shallow, agonized gasps. Peg-Leg Dan lay nearby, his legs shattered, his wooden leg splintered into kindling, but alive. The farmers and Oscar emerged from cover, stunned and deafened. Lucille appeared at Emma's side, her face streaked with dust, but her eyes sharp and clear. She knelt beside Joseph, her expression hard as granite. "You have minutes," she said flatly. "Speak the truth now in front of witnesses, or die knowing your name will be cursed." Joseph's eyes glazed with pain, and the knowledge of approaching death found hers. He understood. There was no escape, no legal maneuvering, no purchased judge to save him now. The farmers gathered close, Sheriff Cobb among them all, watching, all listening. "I paid Dan." Joseph gasped each word a struggle. "Paid Cobb. Paid for the wire for the guns. I needed the spring. Needed her name. The mine. Cost everything. I was going to take it back. Control the water. Control everything. And the Lakota." Lucille pressed writing on a scrap of paper with a stub of pencil, recording every word. "Push them out. Buy their land. Fence it. Sell it." Blood bubbled at his lips. It was legal. All legal. "It was fraud," Lucille said coldly. "It was murder. It was theft. And now it's over." A boulder shifted in the rubble above them, groaning, and the timber across Joseph's chest settled deeper with a sickening crunch. He convulsed, once blood pouring from his mouth, and then his eyes went empty and flat, staring at nothing. Peg-Leg Dan, still conscious and trapped, groaned and tried to reach for a hidden derringer in his boot. One of the farmers clubbed him across the head with a rifle butt, and he went limp. Emma knelt beside Tokala, pressing her hands over the wound in his shoulder, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare die now. Not after everything." Oscar was already there, his medical bag open, working with swift efficiency to pack the wound and bind it tight. "It went through," he said tersely. "Missed the bone. He'll live if we can get him back to town and keep infection out." They fashioned a rough stretcher from salvaged timbers and blankets, and 4 men carried Tokala down the slope toward the horses, Emma walking beside him, and the entire way, her hand gripping his, refusing to let go. 3 weeks later, after days of fever and pain, and the slow, grinding work of healing, Tokala was strong enough to sit up in Oscar's clinic, strong enough to argue about when he would be allowed to leave, strong enough to glare at Emma when she insisted he eat more broth. The circuit judge arrived under escort of Territorial Marshals Judge Whitaker, a stern man with iron-gray hair and a reputation for fairness that was almost legendary in a territory where justice was usually bought and sold like any other commodity. The temporary courthouse was the saloon cleared and scrubbed benches brought in from the church, and every seat filled with townspeople who had come to witness the reckoning. Emma testified first, her voice steady despite the weight of every eye in the room. She described the night in Joseph's store, the overheard conversation, the theft of the documents. She described being tied to the fence left in the sun used as bait. Oscar presented the stolen ledgers and the financial records from the mine. Lucille produced Joseph's dying confession, signed by 3 witnesses, the ink dark and damning. The farmers testified about extortion and water prices that climbed like a noose tightening around their necks. Even Sheriff Cobb, pale and shaking, admitted to taking bribes, his voice barely audible. Judge Whitaker listened without expression, his face carved from granite. When the testimony concluded, he called for the forged deed, and Lucille placed it on the table with ceremonial care. The judge examined it closely, comparing it to territorial records, running his finger along the seal, checking the signatures. "This deed is a forgery," he declared, his voice ringing through the crowded room. "The signature, purporting to be Emma Harrow's, is demonstrably false. The document, while bearing a genuine territorial seal, was never properly filed. It is void and without legal force." He set the papers down and looked over the gallery. "Pending further review by the Department of the Interior through the local Indian agent, this court issues an interim order preserving customary access to Blue Spring by the Lakota band and the small holders who have historically watered there. Any person interfering with that access is to be taken into custody for contempt and bound over for hearing at the next circuit. Sheriff, you will enforce this order. The clerk will transmit copies to the agent and the territorial recorder today." Then Emma stood, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking. "Your Honor, I wish to address the court regarding the doctrine of coverture as it pertains to my case." Whitaker nodded, gesturing for her to proceed. "Joseph Harrow attempted to use coverture as a weapon against me." Emma said, her voice clear and firm, the product of long nights rehearsing with Lucille. "He believed that by coercing me into marriage, he could legally seize my inheritance and any land claims associated with my name. But coverture applies only when a marriage is both legal and consensual. This court has heard testimony that Joseph Harrow attempted to compel my signature through violence, imprisonment, and threats of death. No contract signed under such duress can be considered valid. No marriage performed without genuine consent can be binding under law. I ask this court to declare that my status as an unmarried woman, a female soul, is restored and confirmed, that my inheritance remains solely my own property, and that all claims made by Joseph Harrow against me or my estate are void in their entirety." Judge Whitaker studied her for a long moment, and something that might have been approval flickered in his stern eyes. "Miss Harrow, this court finds that no valid marriage contract or agreement existed between you and the deceased Joseph Harrow. Your legal status as a female soul is hereby confirmed. Your inheritance and all property rights associated with your name remain yours unencumbered by any claim from the estate of Joseph Harrow. Furthermore, while the doctrine of coverture remains the law of this territory, it cannot and will not be permitted to serve as an instrument of fraud, coercion, or criminal conspiracy. This court so rules." A murmur ran through the room, surprise, approval, relief. The judge ordered the forged deed burned. Outside on the courthouse steps, in a metal pan set on the dusty ground, the paper curled and blackened, smoke rising into the clear autumn sky like a prayer answered. The court formally recognized the Lakota band's existing treaty rights to Blue Spring, with provisions allowing controlled access for neighboring small farmers under a cooperative agreement to be overseen by both parties and the territorial government. Peg Leg Dan was remanded to the custody of territorial marshals. Word came back 2 weeks later that he had hanged in Laramie, his last words, a stream of curses no one bothered to record. Sheriff Cobb was stripped of his badge and run out of Wolf's Crossing on a borrowed mule, his face purple with shame and fury, his future uncertain and bleak. Life slowly returned to normal, or what passed for normal, in a town where normal had been violence and corruption. Oscar continued his work treating all comers regardless of color or creed, and his reputation grew. Lucille expanded the schoolhouse, adding a second room with funds donated by grateful farmers, and Tokala's young cousins sat openly at the benches. Now, though fist fights still erupted occasionally in the schoolyard when old prejudices flared, Emma used what remained of her inheritance to purchase a narrow strip of land adjacent to Tokala's pasture, a parcel that touched both his property and the main wagon road. She built a small house, 2 rooms, a porch, a shed, and set up shop as a seamstress and harness mender, working alongside Lucille in the evenings to teach letters to children who had never held a book. On a windswept hill above Diamond Creek, Tokala placed a carved wooden token on the pile of stones that marked Ahanu's grave, and spoke words in Lakota that Emma did not understand but felt in her bones. When he finished, he turned to her, his shoulders still bandaged beneath his shirt, his movements careful. "He would have liked you," Tokala said quietly. "He thought you were brave." "I was terrified," Emma said. "That's what bravery is. Feeling the fear and doing it anyway." One cool afternoon in late September, with the cottonwoods turning gold and the first frost glittering on the grass at dawn, Tokala rode the fence line where his property met Emma's. The fence was nearly complete now, a series of posts driven deep into the earth, strung with wire that glinted in the slanting sunlight. Nailed to the central post was a clean sheet of paper protected by a covering of oiled cloth, bearing the words Emma and Lucille had drafted, and Judge Whitaker had signed. The document declared that Blue Spring and the surrounding grazing land would be jointly overseen by Tokala's band and Emma Harrow, in trust for the small farmers and ranchers of Wolf's Crossing and the surrounding territory. No single party could claim exclusive ownership. No fence could be raised to deny access. Disputes would be settled in town with representatives from both communities present under the eye of law and witnesses. Emma stood beside the post, a hammer in her hand, studying the words as if committing them to memory. Tokala dismounted, moving slowly. The shoulder wound had healed, but it would always be stiff. Always remind him of what had been paid, and stepped beside her. His hand came to rest on the post fingers, brushing hers where they touched the weathered wood. "A fence can be a weapon or a promise," he said quietly. "This one?" Emma asked. "This one keeps thieves out," he said, "and keeps us honest." Emma reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out one final stake carved from cottonwood and smoothed to a pale gleam. "Then we should finish it properly." Together, they walked to the last gap in the fence line where Emma's property ended and Tokala's began, where 2 worlds had been divided by fear and law and violence, and where something new was being built. Emma positioned the stake carefully, checking its alignment, and Tokala held it steady while she raised the hammer. The first blow drove it a foot into the earth, the sound sharp and final in the clear air. The second blow seated it firmly. The third blow struck with all the strength in her arms, made it permanent, a marker, a boundary, a promise that could not be easily broken. When the stake was secure, Emma stepped back, lowering the hammer, and Tokala tested it with his weight, leaning hard. It held solid and true. That evening, as the sun set and painted the grassland in shades of crimson and gold, they stood together at the edge of Blue Spring, watching the water bubble up clear and cold from the stones, watching the horses drink. The land stretched away in all directions, vast and unforgiving and beautiful. And for the first time since she had arrived in Wolf's Crossing, Emma felt something like peace settle into her bones. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft. Takala looked at the fence, at the land, at the future they were building, one stake at a time. Now we keep our promise. We protect what matters. And we see what grows. He did not kiss her. There would be time for that later, perhaps, when winter had passed and the grass turned green again, when trust had deepened into something neither of them needed to name or define. For now it was enough to stand side by side, two people who had chosen each other not from romance or rescue, but from respect earned through fire and blood and the hard, uncompromising work of survival. They mounted and rode back toward the lights of Wolf's Crossing, the town that had tried to break them both. Stars emerged overhead, cold and bright and infinite, and the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Behind them, Blue Spring ran clear and free, guarded not by wire and guns and greed, but by ink and iron, and the quiet, unyielding resolve of two people who had learned that some fences are worth building, some promises are worth keeping, and some partnerships are forged not in softness, but in the crucible of struggle. And that in the end was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.